All right, everybody, this is my attempt of trying to give us some feedback, direction, if you will, on the answer key for the federal structures assignment. So if you have not gotten a full score on that instruction, that federal structures matching exercise, then this is for you. And even if you have, you may benefit from watching this. This is going to help you in revising your section of your term paper for ministry programs and committees, as well as this week 6 worth of work. Knowing who wins, you need to know the structures of government to know who wins within these structures of government. So we're going to go over this matching exercise. So this is the screen up here, and you've seen this. This is the matching exercise. I'm going to have to keep going back and forth on my computer, but hopefully you can still see what's going on the screen. I will check the video. It looks like you can. Okay, so let's keep going. So first thing I told you to look at was in the textbook. This particular, I was about to say it's not working the way I thought it would. So this particular diagram, this is in the chapter on Congress. Okay. Now notice the diagram. 2 sides to the diagram. Why 2 sides? If you can look at this text, and this is on, forgive me, I don't have the textbook, but it's in chapters 5. It's know the facts, the legislative process. Notice you have here House, and over here you have Senate. And then you have all these structures that they go through, and then you have the crisscross. What does that mean? This is reflective of the fact that the legislative branch is in passing laws, you have the legislative branch. That's what we call the legislative process, is the legislative branch. And you have one primary institution, Congress, but that institution is made up of 2 separate sub-institutions, if you will, or sub-chambers. Hence we use the term bicameral, by-chamber, 2 chambers. One chamber being the U.S. House of Representatives, the other chamber being the U.S. Senate. And you learned all the differences between the House and the Senate. House 2-year terms, Senate 4-year terms, House 435 members, Senate 100 members. House represents a specific number of people, district 770,000, around that. Senate represents a state, and that each state has 2 senators. So you have all those differences, but the point is you have those 2 chambers, and for any one bill to become law, it must be approved by both chambers. It has to go through the House, be approved. It has to go through the Senate, be approved. If it starts on the Senate, then it goes to the House separately. If it starts in the House, then it goes to the Senate separately. And then they both have to approve the same bill. Where does this show up in our diagram? Well, which of all these structures has 2 separate sides that are relatively equal? So if we look at this structure on the bottom, I don't see 2 separate sides. I see only one. And everything's vertical. If I look at the one in the middle, sorry about that. If I look at the one in the middle, and let me close this so I get more screen. If I look at the one in the middle, again, I don't see 2 separate equal sides. I see a top, I see 2 halves over here, and I see this big old thing in the bottom. So that doesn't look like what we just described when we talked about the legislative process. So that leaves by default the top box. So this would be the legislative branch. And so A would be legislative branch, right? B would be Congress. All of, or both of those 2 chambers, House and Senate, would be within Congress. They together make up Congress, kind of like our Trinity, our God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. They all make God. We have the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. They together make up the Congress. So you have legislative branch, this dotted line all here. Then you have the Congress inside the legislative branch, pretty much comprising all of that legislative branch. And then you have the House and the Senate. So what's E and F? Well, again, let's go back to our diagram. So if you look underneath here, so bill introduced in House, bill introduced in the Senate, what are the things you see here? Committee, subcommittee, subcommittee, committee, rules committee. So you see all this committee work. This is where the House and the Senate does their work. When they consider bills, when they propose bills, when they pass bills, they're pretty much doing it in committee before they do it before the full House or the full Senate. And so where do we see that in the diagram? E then becomes committees, whereas F becomes subcommittees. Subcommittees just being a subset of the membership of the committee. So committees will be, especially in the House, will be fairly large, sometimes 50 to 70 people. But the subcommittees will be smaller, much more around 10 to 15 in the subcommittees. All right? So that's the legislature. So if that's the legislature, we can move on from them. And let's look at the second figure I had you look at in the executive branch. All right? Specifically the chapter on the president. So this is chapter 6. Bureaucratic institutions in the Obama administration. Really, they didn't have to say the Obama administration. They could have said any administration, any presidential administration. But you have these three. So you have president. And notice, this is where the way they drew diagrams, or Kenneth Coleman, the author of our textbook, the way he drew diagrams differs a little bit from the way I drew the diagram. He put the president off to the side, though, at the top row, and has everything feeding into it from there. All right? But nevertheless, you have this one institution at the top. And then you have what? 1, 2, 3 boxes feeding into that one institution. All right? So again, let's look to our diagram. Where do we see 3 boxes effectively feeding into one box? We see it. Do we see it down here? All right? I see 3 levels, but I don't really see them feeding into any one box. And forgive me, there should be a line from N to O in this diagram. But I don't see them all feeding into one box. I see these feeding into this one. I see this one feeding into that one. And really, that's not 3. So that doesn't really match the characteristics. But then when I look at this middle section, notice I see something. I see H, one box, and everybody, I, J, and K, all feeding into H. So this should trigger to you that this is the executive branch. All right? And so G should be executive branch. H would then be, or who is the head of the executive branch? The head of our executive branch is our U.S. president. And so H is the U.S. president. All right? And then what's I, J, and K? Well, let's look back at that diagram in the textbook. All right? So in the textbook, you had 3 things feeding to the president. All right? Notice the biggest one is the cabinet. All right? And I know it may be tricky to figure out how these two work, but I think it'll be a little more understandable when we look at, well, these other two. So you have the White House staff, feeds directly to the president. Then you have the executive office of the president, which often includes the White House staff down here. You see this, the White House. White House staff is technically part of the executive office of the president, but they take on separate identities because they have separate rules. The textbook tells you all about that, so I won't get into that. But the point is, you have these 2 offices feeding directly to the president, advising the president, all right? And then you have this third one. So as far as where they fit on the diagram, it probably would have been a little bit of trial and error. But if you had read chapter 7, where it talks about the bureaucracy, you may have realized that the cabinet, especially when you looked at that diagram in the text, the cabinet involves a whole bunch of different agencies of the executive branch. The Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, Department of Education, Department of Veteran Affairs, and so on and so forth. You have all these agencies. You don't necessarily have these type of agencies in these other branches. You have different offices of different advisors, but you don't have offices that actually do the work of government. So the cabinet one is different. And so that, to me, if I was doing this exercise, I would have said the cabinet one probably is a little bit different. So I'm going to try to put K down here as cabinet, or put cabinet down here as K. And I'll try, White House staff over here. I'll try executive office of the budget over here, or flip-flop them. As far as the diagram concerned, you can flip-flop them. I know Blackboard, because of the way Blackboard is limited, it expects 1 over here and 1 over there. Trial and error, you'll figure that out. But nevertheless, White House office, executive office of the president. White House staff, I should say, executive office of the president. Cabinet, okay? Now the cabinet, like we said, is made up of all those other agencies, those other departments of the government. So Department of Homeland Security, Department of Transportation, Department of Commerce. That's all these L's. So L is cabinet level departments, all right? Cabinet level agencies. Whereas I and J are White House staff and executive office of president. So if we've taken care of the legislative branch, If we've taken care of the legislative branch, if we've taken care of the executive branch, that leaves us only the judicial branch. Exactly, I think you were with me. And that's down here. And so we can look in our text at this particular diagram of the judicial branch. Let me try to zoom in on that a little bit. It's kind of small. All right? And so you see exactly what we're talking about. You're talking about the 12 circuit courts, and really they put in these other boxes here that kind of describe the process more than the structure. So forgive them for that because that's really kind of confusing. But you have the 94 district courts, you have the 12 regional courts, and then you have the Supreme Court. All right? Yes, you do have some specialty courts over here, the Bankruptcy Court, the Court of International Trade, Court of Federal Claims, and those are important depending on what area of law, constitutional law especially, that you're dealing with. But effectively, you got the 94 district courts, the 12 regional circuit courts, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. All right? So that's the structure there for the federal judicial branch. Let's look on our diagram. You see much the same thing. So M is judicial branch, since we've already taken care of the executive legislative. You have N as the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. O as the circuit courts that report to the Supreme Court. And then P as the U.S. district courts. All right? So hopefully that will explain that exercise. You can still complete that exercise and get the 10 points. Okay? So please, I know it looks like I've done this thing 20 times. Some of you have done it 40 times. Or at least one of you have done it 40 times. Keep doing it. Get the full points. There's no reason to leave points on the table from that exercise. All right? I hope that's been helpful.